Rapture is a body delta. I am the voice, and Big Sister is the hand. When Rapture speaks of you, it says only this: sleep now. Your day is done. Look, it is the world for which you strive. You, alone among the dead.
In part 1 of the philosophy of Bioshock 2, I presented its ideas by looking at the characters and story, as well as framed the method of exploring the philosophical aspects for contextualising further discussion. This part will consist of that discussion, delving deeper into the philosophical foundations, and then go on to provide further analysis and critique from another angle. Auguste Comte was a French philosopher writing between 1830 and 1854, who formulated the doctrine of Positivism, and who also coined the term Altruism. His Positivism was a moral social doctrine which argued for a rational and scientific approach to human society. In the previous part we heard a debate on reason and reality between Ryan and Lamb, where Ryan proposed a positivist epistemology subordinated to egoism. In response, Lamb relies upon the idea of natural law, which posits that a set of laws inherently derive from nature and human evolution, resulting in universal moral principles, which are also discoverable through reason. She emphasises the intrinsic internal existence of these moral laws, and that it is revealed when between people a consensus forms. This emphasis on other people is at the root of Comte's altruism, which simply means prioritising the well-being of others over one's own self-interest. Comte idealistically saw human progress as an evolution from theological and metaphysical thinking to a scientific, structured society where individuals serve a higher social order. In Rapture, under Andrew Ryan, its society was an extreme representation of the individualist tendency of humanity, prior to this altruistic stage. Though, as Comte predicts, albeit after great strife, the coming of Lamb's ideological control brings about a state switch which directly opposes the previous.
Rapture was a city founded to exalt the self, a society of I. This is a contradiction in terms. The individual naturally subverts the collective, resulting in chaos. And so, Rapture failed.
As per Hegel's dialectic, Lamb's antithesis to objectivist rapture relies upon highlighting contradictions and presenting better ideas. However, in her synthesis, she twists both Ryan and Comte's positivist exaltation of external human rationality by supplanting her supposedly intrinsic altruism. Rather than one's duty to others being a voluntary moral necessity, Lamb instead attempts through science to make it absolute, negating naturally evolved and innate human rationality altogether.
Ryan was wrong. To hand sufficient power to any individual is to create a tyrant. We must therefore eradicate tyranny at the genetic level, to end sin itself. That is the family. That is our cause.
Lamb envisions a society where people function as a single unit, stripping away personal ambition for the betterment of the whole. But in enforcing altruism through coercion, she creates a system just as oppressive as Ryan's, where the individual is no longer free to choose selflessness, but is instead bound to it by force. In doing so, she likewise pits her thesis against the indelible reality of human nature. This returns an absolute contradiction in the form of her daughter Eleanor's rejection of her mother's will through her own. Jeremy Bentham formulated utilitarian theory over the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Its main assertion is of utility, that the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. Whatever maximises happiness and minimises suffering is the right course of action. Bentham had sought a rational way to measure utility through a systemic moral calculus. Lamb echoes this, declaring,
I was to teach a simple moral calculus. Each choice as though the world must bear it. Each life or death for the common good. Each of us has a moral duty to increase the common joy and ease the common pain.
She claims to act for the well-being of all, advocating for a society that operates as a single harmonious unit. However, where Bentham sought to measure happiness, Lamb dictates it. Her Rapture family does not merely calculate well-being, it demands absolute unity, erasing individual desires in pursuit of a predetermined common good.
Alone, we are nothing, mere engines of self-interest. Together, we are the family, and through unity, we transcend the self.
In doing so, she transforms Bentham's utilitarian principle into an absolute doctrine, where dissent is an unacceptable disruption of collective happiness. This rigidity precludes the ability to assess true utility, as the family's well-being is defined solely by Lamb's ideological whims, not by an individual, liberal or democratic reasoning. John Stuart Mill's definition of utilitarianism. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are as right in proportion as they are to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure, and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain, and the privation of pleasure. To give a clear view of the moral standards set by the theory, much more requires to be said. In particular, what things it includes in the ideas of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. But the supplementary explanations do not affect the theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded, namely, that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves, or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain.
What is good? Only one definition endures. Good is pleasure in the absence of suffering. What then is the greater good? To calculate pleasure or suffering in the majority, we must account for the dimension of time. Each act must be measured not merely within the moment, but against all causality. The greater good, therefore, equates to total pleasure over time.
John Stuart Mill is the most important philosopher in comparison to Sophia Lamb, as the game's creative director, Jordan Thomas, specifically chose aspects of his life and ideas for her inspiration. John's youth was dictated entirely by his father, James, who was an adherent of Bentham's utilitarianism. James educated his son intensely so that he may become a champion of utilitarian thinking. The means for achieving this meant keeping him out of society, from interacting with anyone his age, and without the access to any religious teaching or texts. The mental strain of this upbringing caused John to have a mental breakdown by the time he'd reached adulthood, at which point he'd reformed the strict Benthamite utilitarian ideal to better fit humanity as it was, with a liberal string attached having read Adam Smith. Resultantly, John Stuart Mill's works from his 1859 book On Liberty onwards emphasised more than just utility. These ideas included individual liberty, a distinction between higher and lower pleasures, and differently humanist assumptions around Epicurus, adding in elements of both Stoicism and Christianity. In comparison with Bioshock 2 Sophia Lamb then, she was raised by her father in a similar way, though was sent out into society to study at university and even work abroad. Regardless, her eventual decisions in Rapture lead to her representing the role of her father in an extreme way through raising Eleanor as a first utopian. Just for Eleanor to break out of her conditioning and forge something of her own path, much as Mill did. Mill's refinement of Bentham's utilitarianism promoted individual freedom as a necessity for human flourishing, because he believed that progress came from diverse perspectives, that no single person or authority could define what was best for all. Mill's inclusion of individualism stands in direct opposition to Lamb's collectivist vision, which regards individual will as an inherent danger.
The individual naturally subverts the collective, resulting in chaos.
Where Mill saw personal choice as a necessary condition for moral progress, Lamb views it as a flaw in human nature, an obstacle to utopia. She extends this logic to the illusion of free will itself.
Think, I will smile, and act as such. Congratulations. You have just experienced the illusion of free will. Now think, I will never become angry again, and act as such. The illusion begins to break down. Your genes have no objection to an empty smile, but anger to the gene is part of the program. I submit the following conclusion. The gene is the enemy.
In her society, freedom is not a guiding principle, but a self-deception that must be overcome. So, while Mill sought to balance liberty and well-being, Lamb's family eliminates the concept of liberty entirely, believing that only in absolute unity can the whole of society avoid suffering. Foresight of phenomenon and power over them depend on knowledge of their sequences, and not upon any notion we may have formed respecting their origin or inmost nature. This is an excerpt from John Stuart Mill's book, Auguste, Comte and Positivism, a thinker and his theory mentioned in a previous chapter. This book analyses the implications of Comte's positivist philosophy, which asserts that knowledge is derived solely from empirical evidence and observable phenomena. He focuses on Comte's argument that human knowledge and reasoning evolves through distinct stages, theological to metaphysical, and finally the positivist, where knowledge relies primarily on observable phenomena. Mill supports but also scrutinises these ideas so as to present the strengths and weaknesses of positivism as a guiding philosophy for understanding human society and science, something which utilitarian thought was based upon. Though what is traded away with each evolution of human reasoning is the certainty of the old system, resulting in a struggle to find certainty in the next, this echoing again the Hegelian dialectic. Another of Mill's quotes from Auguste Comte and Positivism mirrors the dialectic of Ryan and Lamb's ideologies. It is with philosophy as with religion. Men marvel at the absurdity of other people's tenets, while exactly parallel absurdities remain in their own. Sophia Lamb's poker game, where she purposefully loses so as to redistribute wealth to the least capable, poorest players, shows the socialist intention of enforced equality in capital, begging a comparison with Karl Marx. He saw capitalism as a socio-economic system of inequality, alienation and exploitation, but envisioned and predicted a world where class divisions would be abolished and resources distributed equitably. Lamb, in fact, draws from Marx's critique of individualism as part of this system, condemning Ryan's vision of rapture.
Ryan saw the individual as a hero, a noble survivor, and rapture was his paradise, a shrine to the supremacy of the self. The result? Slavery, genocide, chaos. Now that the tyrant is dead, we are a true collective, a single family.
Where Marx sought a classless society without private ownership, Lamb aims to erase the very concept of the private and of personal ambition, making her family a singular entity without internal contradiction. Though while Marx envisioned a proletarian revolution that would liberate the oppressed, Lamb's solution is far more extreme in saying,
we must therefore eradicate tyranny at the genetic level.
By viewing self-interest as an inherent biological flaw, she departs from Marx's materialist view of history and instead frames the problem as a matter of human nature itself. Marx's ideology claimed to free people from an exploitative society. Lamb's came to be about remaking people themselves. The result was not a socialist utopia then, but a totalitarian system where individual identity is erased in the name of collective survival. Immanuel Kant argued that morality arises from duty, not from consequence. His categorical imperative holds that actions must be guided by absolute universal principles that still represent human autonomy. His deontological ethics is a normative theory, meaning that it supposes to establish a standard of behaviour one ought to carry out, almost regardless of circumstance. Kant ultimately saw the practice of morality as something each rational individual must choose, rather than something imposed externally. Lamb, however, denies the very possibility of free moral agency.
Free will evolved, my friends. The illusion of control is a trick of the gene, vanishing in an instant the moment we are sufficiently tempted.
If free will is an illusion, then without the ability to choose, moral responsibility must be imposed from above, ostensibly through the family's collective will, but in reality through Lamb's alone. Instead of a society where people freely choose to act morally, Lamb envisions one where morality is predetermined and deviations from the collective will are considered flaws to be corrected. In doing so, she strips moral choice from the individual, making morality a function of genetic and social engineering rather than rational autonomy. Particularly with Eleanor, Kant would have abhorred the use of people as a means to an end, instead championing their respect and entitlement to the truth. On truth, Kant's dialectic examines the limits of human reason in its pursuit. In his 1781 book, Critique of Pure Reason, he distinguishes between phenomena, what we can know, and noumena, what lies beyond experience. The dialectic reveals how reason, when overextended, reveals contradictions. Kant argues that, while speculative metaphysics fails, practical reason grounded in moral law offers a rational foundation for belief in freedom, God, and the soul. His dialectic thus refines reason's role, guiding it away from illusion towards a critical, self-aware pursuit of knowledge and rationality. As we've seen, Hegel's dialectic builds upon Kant's, but instead of viewing contradictions as limitations of reason, Hegel sees them as the driving force of reality's development, a process of negation and affirmation. In his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, Richard Dawkins introduces the idea that genes operate based on a model of self-interest. His hypothesis is that the primary unit of natural selection is the gene over generations, rather than the individual organism. They metaphorically act in their own self-interest to ensure their replication. Whilst acknowledging this idea, the ethicist Peter Singer argues for greater complexity in the model, particularly in humans. Singer points out that people can override this genetic selfishness through ethical reasoning, something he champions in his effective Altruism. Lamb builds upon this particular view, though distorting it somewhat and intensifying it, seeing biological self-interests as the root of human suffering.
The human animal, like the gene, serves only the self. We are born believing that the world turns for us alone, and we die in the futile attempt to make it so.
Lamb argues that free will is nothing more than an evolutionary deception when she says,
"The gene makes a tyrant of us all."
While Singer hoped that reason and morality could guide humans toward genuine altruism, Lamb believes altruism must be enforced as a corrective to human nature. By doing so, she turns a naturalistic observation into a moral imperative, making genetic correction the foundation of her new ideology. In her society, there must be no struggle between self-interest and morality, as self-interest is simply an error to be erased. Yet, in trying to engineer a selfless society, she removes the very conditions that make altruism meaningful. Back in Andrew Ryan's rapture before the Civil War, his society was a meritocracy, free from external control. Richard Dawkins' selfish gene theory would provide a biological basis for such a society, because genes, selfishly, prioritise their survival. Both the gene and citizen of rapture emphasise the self over the collective, dismissing higher-level authority. But where Ryan's self-interest is an ideological human choice, Dawkins supposes a purely mechanical, biological fact that is amoral. Despite this, rapture fails from the very greed that it was rationalised as good. Andrew Ryan's rational rejection of altruism as parasitic decries the burden of the weak. But Peter Singer's effective altruism urges maximising the good for everybody through reason. He argues that we're morally obligated to help others, especially the disadvantaged, in an efficient way, as a duty. His effective altruism is built upon a utilitarian framework called preference utilitarianism. This says that actions are right if they maximise the satisfaction of preferences, rather than solely focusing on maximising happiness. Where Ryan asks, "What do I owe myself?" Singer asks, "What do I owe the world?" With the lineage of each of these thinkers defined, we can see how strands of their thought originated and were synthesized over time, from Kant, Bentham, Hegel and Comte, to Mill, Marx, Dawkins and Singer. These and more, whether explicitly or not, influenced the ideology of Sophia Lamb and the themes of Bioshock 2 as a whole. Though, just as the first game, the setting is dystopian by design, there's still a fair representation of Lamb's thesis given in the audio tapes prior to the Civil War. The success of her arguments are also shown in the rapid growth of her following. However, just as Ryan with Rapture to begin with, once Lamb got full control and the ability to implement her ideas to the maximum extent, they were proven maximally destructive. The whole Bioshock series presents societal collapse, which we may look at through the lens of cyclical history in sociology theories proposed by the likes of Oswald Spengler, Pitirim Sorokin, Arnold Toynbee, Hans Freyer, and Pt.2 Turchin. They offer theories that predicate civilization's rise and fall in predictable cycles, often due to internal contradictions and structural tensions alone. Rapture, the city at the bottom of the ocean, envisioned as a utopia, still follows this pattern. Though its size is small and cycle of growth and death is rapid, as it is a self-contained city-state, it provides a unique example to apply these theories to. Each theorist will provide a framework to understand how Rapture's fate was perhaps predictable and inevitable. Spengler's Decline of the West, released in 2 volumes between 1918 and 1922, argues that civilizations pass through organic life cycles of birth, growth and decay. Rapture, initially flourishing under Ryan's pure laissez-faire capitalism and materialistic culture, succumbed to decay as quickly as it grew, having met the conditions to do so. Spengler's reasons for civilizational decline are, as we see, a less defined or exhausted culture, materialistic over metaphysical dispositions, and the necessity for authoritarian responses to increasing chaos and a loss of spirit. Each of Rapture's leading figures, such as Ryan, Atlas and Lamb, were or came to be overly focused on materialism and rationalism, and were incapable of matching chaos with order without resorting to manipulative methods of control. It was only Rapture's earliest years where its spirit was worthy of civilization. Toynbee's challenge and response theory posits that civilizations collapse when they fail to creatively respond to challenges. This is laid out in his 12-volume study of world history published between 1934 and 1961. He felt that traditional explanations of environment, race, leadership, possession of land and access to natural resources were too narrow. Instead, he looked for the underlying cause that explained societal success or failure. By challenge, Toynbee meant some unpredictable factor or event that posed a threat to the ways in which a group of people had been living. Importantly, challenge was not purely negative, but carried an opportunity. Response was the action taken by those people to cope with a new situation. Response required vision, leadership, and action to make the best of change. Rapture's rigid adherence to radical forms of objectivism and then utilitarianism meant that its leaders were incapable of adapting to such crises. The rabid competition without regulation, atom addiction, class conflict and more ensured a collapse. Sorokin's Societal and Cultural Dynamics, published in 4 volumes between 1937 and 1941, describes historical societal cycles shifting between ideational, idealistic and sensate cultures. Each cultural type influences societal values, norms and institutions, contributing to the cyclical and predictable nature of social change. Ideational culture is dominated by spirituality and metaphysical beliefs. Idealistic culture focuses on values, ethics and moral principles, Sensate culture prioritises empirical and sensory experiences. Rapture started as a part idealistic, part sensate culture, having been transposed from the outside world, where such a stage had already been reached. Of course, the societal pressure, abuse, and gene splicing, combined with another of Sorokin's terms, societal stratification and social conflict, had society on a precipice. Conflict in the form of a class war pushed it over, and post-collapse, Lamb's efforts to reinvigorate an idealistic society fared no better. Freyer's institutionalization of radicalism and sociological determinism suggests that radical ideologies, when institutionalized, bring about their own demise. Also that such sociological changes could be defined as determinable or cyclical. Using Hegelian philosophy and guidance of his teacher Karl Freyer defined the cyclical repetition of cultural periods. He divided historical periods into those that are positive and negative. The feudal estate system is an example of a positive period, where there is a functional hierarchy of estates, the highest level of social and moral integration, and the most creative organisation of people. The survival of the feudal society depends on the ability of the ruling caste to use force and prevent rebellions. Since it is built on inequality and domination, the feudal order constantly carries the germ of conflict and revolution. Democratic revolutions created civil society, but also class rule. In civil societies, the possibility of class struggle is constantly present. In Ryan's individualist rapture, such a class struggle brought about collapse, and Lamb's collectivist rehabilitation also self-destructed. Each was destroyed by its antithesis, proving the society's negative. Turchin and his colleagues' structural demographic theory is a tool for understanding long-term social pressures that lead to revolutions, civil wars, and other major outbreaks of socio-political instability. The theory represents complex human societies as systems with three main compartments: the general population, the elites, and the state. One application of these compartments to rapture would be that the citizens and then splicers were the general population, Ryan, the council, and a few other figures such as Frank Fontaine were the elites, and the state was minimal. The theory comes to explain that societies collapse due to elite overproduction, economic disparity, and internal conflict. Rapture's economic disparities, class tensions, and unchecked ambitions of figures like Frank Fontaine and later Atlas mirror Turchin's explanation for societal breakdowns. Lamb's hopes to flatten the general population and elite into one, as completely subordinate to a collective good, also came to ruin. Lamb had to rely on authoritarian control too, utilising psychological conditioning, imprisonment, and an army of splicers. This aligns with Turchin's notion that, as ruling elites face declining legitimacy, they resort to greater coercion. However, repression tends to backfire, leading to greater unrest, seen in uprisings against her leadership and her eventual downfall. Applying these ideas, we can see how rapture and its radical regimes follow the predictable cycles of rise and decline described by cyclical theorists. Ryan and Lamb's ideological blindness, unwillingness to adapt, and failure to address the true grievances of their people doomed them all.
Utopia. Said aloud, it evokes heaven on earth. Yet the word means both good place and no place. An ideal, unreachable. Even in the naming of it, we refuse to believe. And yet, we will forever seek utopia, driven always to want more, no matter how much we have. It is among the grandest of human ironies that our very drive to find utopia has kept us from abiding there.
This marks the end of the 4-part Philosophy of Bioshock 1 and 2 series. There are of course other thinkers and ideas which could be applied to the games, but I think we've covered the most applicable. This of course leaves us with just one game left in the series with which to review, Bioshock Infinite, which lacks a lot of the philosophical backings that the previous 2 games drew from. There are however other interesting ideas and discussions to be had about it. Until then, thank you very much for watching. Meta Britain.